All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. This is Unit 7, World War II, and this is still, it's a big one. Lesson 4, A War on Two Fronts. This is going to be the last part of it, part 4 of this lesson about the fighting of World War II. And we're turning our focus to the Pacific theater of the war. Where, if you will recall, on December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the Empire of Japan they sucker punched us, right? They did that surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, right here in Hawaii. Okay, there's Pearl Harbor. And by doing that, they basically took out most of our entire Pacific fleet of ships in our Navy. So we were unable to defend our colony of the Philippines and our allies' colonies, such as Indochina over here and Burma, these other places. And so that's what the Japanese do. Almost the same time as they're attacking Pearl Harbor, their other fleet is going down south. Here's Japan. They'd already taken over the Korean Peninsula, Manchuria, northern China, the Rape of Nanking, all of that. And so now, after taking out our fleet, they go and they take the Philippines. Remember, MacArthur wades out into the water. He leaves his troops behind and says, I shall return, because there was no hope for reinforcements. There was nothing that could be done to save those troops because our reinforcements had just been destroyed. Pearl Harbor was in flames. So they have no help coming. And eventually, the forces left on the Philippines are forced to surrender, and they have that terrible Bataan Death March. And now that the Japanese control the Philippines, they have control of these shipping lanes. So they are free to send their military and their fleets to go down to Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all of Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and all of these places here, such as Papua New Guinea. They are carving out a Pacific empire because remember, Japan needs ships, they need supplies, they need oil, they need rubber, they need metal, they need all of these materials, and their islands can only provide so much. And so it's about power, but it's also about resources for Japan. They want to extend down into Australia. Now, Australia, the land down under, mate, right? Australia is part of the British Commonwealth, and Australia today is its own independent nation. They were more closely aligned with the mother country of Britain at this time. And basically, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, fought over in the Solomon Islands over here, Japan was attempting to go further south and actually take Australia. But our naval fleet is able to stop the Japanese advance for the first time and keep them from going further south and into Australia. There at the Battle of the Coral Sea. We'll fight other big battles down in Indonesia and near Australia, such as the Battle of Guadalcanal. These are heavy, hard fought battles. And what we're doing in our overall strategy is something called island hopping, where we are attempting to go from island to island to try to get ever closer to mainland Japan, or at least get close enough to bomb it. And that's our strategy on how to defeat the Japanese, because we're fighting in an ocean. The Pacific Ocean is the largest ocean in the world. How do you do this? Well, you send your fleet of ships and you retake each little island that Japan has taken. You deploy your Marines, you use your planes that you can launch off the deck of those aircraft carriers, those floating airports, basically. It's what an aircraft carrier is. And you retake the islands. And so this is going to be Marines being deployed on each of these. This is going to be naval combat. This is going to be aerial combat. This is all how it's going to take place in the Pacific. And again, our objective in our island hopping campaign is to get close enough to mainland Japan right here to be able to bomb them into submission, to get them to stop, to win the war. The big turning point. We talk about turning points as when the tide of the war, who's winning and who's losing, changes. In the European theater of World War II, when we're fighting the Nazis, the big turning point came with the Battle of D-Day, the invasion of Normandy or northern France on June 6, 1944, because that's when we're able to open up a Western front and begin to box Hitler in, right? The big turning point that's going to occur in the Pacific theater of the war is going to be at the Battle of Midway. Now, again, let me go to a map here and show you. Midway is this little spit of land, like it's tiny. You can basically fit like a little airport on it, and that's about it. It's way smaller than any of the Hawaiian Islands. But it is located right dab smack dab in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, which is why it's called Midway. Nothing to do with like the Panthers in Woodway. A student asked that one year. I was like, no, it's nothing to do with them. So that is where Midway Island is, and there's going to be this major naval battle that takes place there. Okay, basically over strategic geographic control, because whoever controls Midway can kind of have that cutting off point right in the middle of the Pacific from which to launch their operations from. So for the United States, our key to Midway is going to be really with um, our code breakers. Okay, and so both sides, all sides in the war, are using code to transmit communications. So if your generals and your political leaders, if they want to send a order to their fleet, like to their ships or to their military, they would put that communication in secret code so that if the enemy intercepted it, they would not be able to understand it. That was very important as interception was happening all the time. Now, we had broken, our code breakers had actually broken the Japanese code. We knew most of what they were saying. And yet the Japanese hadn't really broken our code. And more on that later. We'll talk about the Navajo code talkers in just a second, which are going to be super important for helping us to win this war against the Japanese. But our code breakers had broken the Japanese code. We knew what they were saying. This gave us a huge, huge leg up, a huge advantage over the Japanese, which is going to prove very advantageous at the Battle of Midway. It's why we win. And so what we did to try to figure out where the Japanese were going to be attacking next, because we didn't know, was we intercepted their code, and then we relayed in a code we know that the Japanese could break, that we were going to be having a problem at 3 different strategic sites that we thought might be attacked. One of them was like in the Aleutian Islands, which is like the tail islands of Alaska. One was at Midway, and the other I think was like Pearl Harbor or somewhere, okay, in Hawaii. And so at each of these different places that we feared the Japanese might be attacking next, but we weren't sure, we said they had a different problem. So like there was a munitions, lack of munitions at the Aleutian Islands, or there was an electrical malfunction at Pearl Harbor. And at Midway, we said that the water desalination plant was having some difficulties. That's how they would convert, salt water from the ocean into fresh water for drinking for the troops and stuff. And then our code breakers listened in to what the Japanese had to say, since we made it, kind of easy for them to get these messages. Okay, now what are the Japanese going to say about all this? And we heard them with our code breakers basically say that, oh, the place that we plan on attacking has had a recent problem with their desalination plant, and it's like, oh, gotcha. Gotcha. We know where you're going to attack. You're going to attack Midway because that's the trap that we set for you. And so we knew exactly when and where they were going to be attacking. And this is what's going to allow us to have the advantage here. It's mostly a naval battle that's taking place. And at the Battle of Midway, we are able to sink 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers. Those are the really big ships. Those are the prize of the fleet. Not only are they enormous, but they also have all the airplanes which can take off and land from them. They're floating airports. And the airplanes are what you can use to bomb, torpedo, reconnaissance, everything else. The other thing that's going to happen, with the code breaking is that the following year, 1943, because of our, being able to understand what the Japanese were saying and they couldn't understand us, we'd broken their code. We're going to have their main naval admiral, their top naval commander, assassinated. We will shoot him out of the sky as he was flying to some of his troops and stuff. And that was Izoroyu Yamamoto. We kill him. We assassinated Yamamoto. All right, so that is the Battle of Midway, and now we control at least the middle of the Pacific. We can begin to launch our island hopping campaign, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to go from Midway to Wake Island to the Marshall Islands, Battle of Coral Sea. We stop the Japanese advance and protect Australia. Battle of Guadalcanal. Doris Miller, our hometown Waco hero, he dies in the campaign down here. Remember, about 2 years to the day, on December 7th, after he'd been that great hero at Pearl Harbor. And we're going to continue. We're going to retake the Philippines, just as MacArthur had promised. MacArthur, by the way, Douglas MacArthur is in charge of all of our ground forces, the Marines who are fighting to retake these islands on the ground. Remember, the Navy is also playing a very crucial role in this fight as well. And then it starts to get really, really scary if it wasn't already, as we start to take these islands that are actually part of Japan, these tiny little tail islands that are in here. Some of them are so microscopic you can't see them on this map. But those islands will be very hard fought because you can see they are located really close to Japan, within bombing range of our big planes. So that's again island hopping. We're going to work our way close enough to bomb them. Here's one of our American aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise. You ever watch Star Trek? There you go. Live long and prosper. I can't even do the live long and prosper. No, that's not it. That's the rock on sign. What is the live long and prosper? That's the horns UT. I don't know. I'm not a Trekkie, obviously. I'm more of a Star Wars fan, but my brother's a huge Trekkie, and if he ever sees this, I'm sorry, bro. I let you down. But anyway, the USS Enterprise, there she is under heavy attack by the Japanese Navy during the Battle of Midway. You can see, again, it's a naval battle. It's not really fought on land at all because Midway is a tiny spit of land. And all these little dark clouds are explosions going off as all these ships have their anti-aircraft guns firing, trying to shoot down the Japanese planes and the American planes as they're flying and trying to kill each other and bomb the ships. It was a hot mess. The Battle of Midway is also the topic of the recent movie Midway, which was actually a really good movie. It's kind of underrated, showing some of the heroes that won that crucial turning point battle that day. And speaking of heroes that helped us to win this, let's talk about the Navajo. The Navajo is an ancient southwestern tribe of Native Americans. And remember how America has treated Native Americans so far. In our class, we talked about the Indian Wars. We talked about the massacre, the genocide of natives. Natives who were not killed during the Indian Wars were forced onto reservations. It was terrible what America did to Native Americans, pushed them off their land to make room for the white man, and then forced them to assimilate under like the Dawes Act. But here you have in World War II, Native American tribes actually fighting for the country that had done all this to them. It's unbelievable. It's like the African Americans who served so bravely in World War II for a country that treated them so badly. Like these men are absolute heroes. It's amazing what they were able to do and overcome. And the Navajo, their secret weapon in World War II was their language, the Navajo language. You could see some of the words here that are translated. Ships is like Todine I. I'm not going to try anymore because I'm just going to butcher this lovely language, but you get the idea. The Navajo language was only a spoken language before World War II. They're going to recruit the Navajo as code talkers. So you have code breakers that break code and figure out what the enemy is saying. Code talkers are the ones who would transmit your code in a way that the enemy can't understand. And what better way to do that than have a Native American speaking their language, which is not recorded in any books anywhere? Nobody who is not a Navajo can learn this language. It is only like it was passed down in oral tradition. And so it was the Navajo that basically gave all of the communications for the American side, and the Japanese, they'd be listening in, trying to, and they'd hear, the Navajo speakers. One would be like at our major base and the Pacific operations in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. There'd be a Navajo that would be, talking, through the radio and transmitting the directions for our fleet and stuff. And then there'd be a Navajo that would be at the ships with the fleets receiving the communication, and it would all be in Navajo that they were communicating. And the Japanese would be listening in. They could hear them. They intercepted our communication, but they had no clue what was being said. Because again, there's no way you can learn Navajo unless you are actually a Navajo person. It was not a language that was taught anywhere. It was only learned by Navajo. So that was one of the biggest advantages that we had in World War II. These guys were invaluable in our efforts to win against the Japanese. All right, so here's what island hopping looks like. You could see We win the battle midway, and then we are off to the races. We are gaining all these footholds, taking back all these islands from the Japanese, and then it's just these last islands. And remember, also when we retake the Philippines, that's when we liberate those prisoners of war that had been taken to the concentration camp, the prisoner of war camp, there in on Luzon, the big island of the Philippines. Those were the survivors of the Bataan Death March. Remember the Bataan Death March. And so there were horrible atrocities committed by all sides in World War II, certainly, but some of the fiercest fighting takes place on those last little islands. So here's a little bit of a closer view. You can see these tiny islands. Okinawa is right here, and Iwo Jima is over here. Okay, and so again on the big map, we're talking about like right here. Okay, little tiny islands, Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima was the first one that we're going to take. And in both of these, they put us within range to bomb mainland Japan. And the Japanese, they knew this. They knew that this was their last possible stand to protect their homeland, that the Japanese defenders on these islands were the last stand for protecting their families and their farms and their homes. And that's why they were willing to die to the last. This is when you get the fabled kamikaze Japanese pilots or the suicide pilots, who basically by the end of the war here, Japan had so few pilots, they weren't even training them really how to land. They would have these young men take a shot of sake, which is a strong Japanese alcoholic beverage. They would put on the banzai headdress right here. Here's some kamikaze pilots. And they would get into a plane and then fly that plane into the side of an American ship. They would basically use the plane as the weapon, because it was going to be devastating. And this photo is real. Like, it was taken by an American sailor as this Japanese plane is attempting to fly into the side of the ship. So that's the kamikazes. The term kamikaze comes from the Japanese word meaning the divine wind, the kamikaze. It's in reference to Japan's history, that it was one of the few places not to be invaded by the Mongol horde, the Mongol Empire. The Mongols were strong on land. They were a cavalry-based military. They relied on their horses and they fought from horseback. And when they tried to load up their cavalry and all their horses on these ships to invade Japan, a fierce storm, a hurricane almost, blew them back and destroyed their whole Mongol invasion fleet in the Sea of Japan. And the Japanese felt like that was divine intervention, that the gods had saved their islands, and they called that the divine wind. So that's what the kamikaze pilot name, the suicide pilots, were in reference to. So you have that going on. At Iwo Jima, you're going to have both of these islands are very small and they're also very rocky. And the Japanese, they knew the lay of the land. They also knew and had dug out even more of the tunnels in the rocks and in the cliffs. And they're going to use these fortifications and these tunnels and these tunnel networks to basically fight for as long as possible. We couldn't just bomb the islands from afar because they were so entrenched in these tunnels and caves. So we're actually going to have to send in the Marines and go and root them out, which is going to be extremely costly. Again, this is some of the fiercest fighting in all of World War II. The famous Clint Eastwood movies, Flags of Our Fathers, is set to the Battle of Iwo Jima, to the famous iconic stage photograph of the American Marines hoisting the flag of the United States on the island after we had this hard fought victory. The Japanese commander of the Battle of Iwo Jima, the defense commander, he did a good job marshaling his troops. And apparently, by all reports, he was very honorable. He knew that he was being charged with a death suicide mission to basically try to defend this island and defend Japan to the last man. And that's what he did. And he also apparently had been to the United States before and spoke some English and other stuff. One of his subordinates, one of his lieutenants, had actually also spoke English and had some American friends. Had competed in the equestrian Olympic Games, I think, alongside Patton. I didn't mention this before, but George Patton was a a lover of horses, and he loved riding and was a very talented equestrian. Patton had actually competed in the Olympics himself. The general that we talked about, who had the dirty mouth, he liked to curse a lot. George Patton had been what they call a pentathlete. That means you compete in the Olympics in 5 sports, shooting, was it swimming, running, no, shooting, swimming, fencing, running, and stadium jumping, where you have the horse and you jump over stuff. But Patton, actually, Operation Cowboy in World War II, Patton will be part of this mission to rescue the famous Spanish riding school Limpizan horses, some of the greatest dressage horses and one of the most iconic breeds of horses in the world. The white Limpizan stallions and the broodmares of the Spanish riding school were under threat of being butchered basically by the Russians at the end of World War II, depending on who got there first. And so Patton had a rescue mission to rescue some of the villagers, but also to rescue the horses there because he loved the horses. The Japanese. One of the Japanese commanders at Iwo Jima, I think, had been with Patton at the Olympics many years before, competing in the show jumping as well. It's where you jump over the big obstacles with the horses. Anyway, just the movie Clint Eastwood made, that Flies of Our Fathers, that one's okay. But the movie I like more is the companion movie that he made, called Letters from Iwo Jima, which is actually, it's filmed entirely, in actual Japanese, which is more appropriate, with subtitles. Which all you guys who love watching anime, and you don't watch it dubbed, you watch it subbed, you probably would be just fine watching this movie. It is very bloody, but it's also a great story of honor and death and struggle, and what, it's humanizing our enemy in the war, that I think was really touching about that movie. Now in Okinawa, again, there's the cliffs and the caves and everything else. There's also this massive ridge, Hacksaw Ridge, that Mel Gibson made a movie about recently, starring the medic, who is a conscientious objector, who's going to spend the war saving people instead of killing them. His name was Desmond Doss. And that movie's all about the Battle of Okinawa, which was the bloodiest fighting, the last battle, the last major battle, on our way to being able to bomb the Japanese mainland. Now, the Japanese civilians that were on these islands when the American fleet was approaching, there were reports that some of them, like, they took their families, the mothers would take their kids, the Japanese families, and they would jump off the cliffs rather than face the Americans, because their propaganda. Remember, we talked about propaganda from the Germans showing the Jews as terrible fungus-like, mushroom nasty people, subhumans. The Japanese had, every country had their own propaganda, and the Japanese were being taught to believe that Americans were all monsters that were going to rape and kill them all. And so many of the Japanese citizens, they would rather kill themselves than face being captured by the American soldiers. And so that was what was happening. And meanwhile, once we take these islands, now we're within range to bomb mainland Japan, and that is what we will do. We will bomb them and bomb them and bomb them. The fire bombings of Tokyo, you could see an aerial photo from above of Tokyo, the largest city in Japan. All of the white is fire explosions going off. We killed over 80,000 citizens in Tokyo just from the fire bombings. That was more deadly, immediately more deadly than even the atomic bombs. So it's not just atomic bombs, it's also lots of little bombs can do a lot of damage as well. All right. Summarize the course of World War II in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945. We begin using our island hopping strategy to take all of these little islands as we make our way ever closer to mainland Japan. We retake the Philippines as MacArthur had promised, and then we get to the last islands that are within bombing range of mainland Japan. We take Iwo Jima, and then we take Okinawa, and then we can begin to actually do the fire bombings. And then there will be a new weapon we will try out that will help us to finally end the war. And that will, of course, be the nuclear weapons, the atomic bomb. But let's talk about a few other inventions first, and then sorry about that. All right, so we're going to talk about some of the new science and technology that's going to be invented during the war. That's going to prove pretty important. The first thing on the list you need to know about is penicillin. Penicillin is a medicine. It's an antibiotic, so it's meant to fight infection. Penicillin is going to help to save a whole lot of soldiers in World War II, and I believe World War II was the first time that we had penicillin available. So that was a game changer as far as saving many lives of soldiers in the long term. Because in World War One and in previous wars, somebody would get shot and maybe they survived the initial shooting, or they'd get exploded and they'd lose an arm or a leg, and they'd have an amputation done. Amputations were very common, but oftentimes when that happened, it would be in the days and weeks that would follow that the soldiers would die from infection. Penicillin is going to change that. It's not going to save every life, of course, but it is going to do a lot to help a lot of them. Okay. All right, and the next one is plasma. Plasma is like synthetic blood. Okay, it's when you're basically making, you're able to produce synthetic blood, and this is going to be in bags. It's not going to need to be kept as cold. It lasts a lot longer than actual blood that's taken from transfusions and stuff. Plasma is going to be essential, just like penicillin, in saving a whole lot of soldiers' lives, because a lot of soldiers, they're at risk for dying from loss of blood when they're shot or wounded or other stuff. And so plasma is going to make a big difference for that. And then finally, nylon. I showed here nylon, like for pantyhose, for a woman's tights and stuff, was very fashionable back in the 1930s and 40s. It's made out of nylon. So sometimes nylons were just, that was what you called a woman's tights that she wore, under her dress and stuff. But nylon can also be used in war for many other things, for rope, for halters and harnesses, and going on with those paratroopers, especially for their parachutes. Most parachutes were made out of nylon because it's a very durable fabric. There are many, many other inventions that you need to know about in World War II. So here's another list of the most notable ones. I already mentioned penicillin and plasma and nylon for parachutes, but did you know that also the radar was invented, first used by the British to detect when German bombers were coming to do their bombing raids, like on London and stuff during the Battle of Britain. Radar is used to detect when things are coming in at you from the air. Sonar is used to detect things that are underwater. Remember, that'd be used like with submarines and U-boats and stuff. Um, Calculating machines are used for code breaking. They process through thousands of lines of data to try to distinguish a code, a pattern that forms. And these early calculating machines are like the ancestor of the modern computer. This is the very beginning of computing technology, computers themselves. Now, obviously, it's not the same as a computer today, but it will help form the basic beginnings of the computers that we will see the beginning of in the 1950s for the space race when we're in the Cold War. And this is like Alan Turing. And there's also I'll put it in the Ed puzzle, but there was also a female code breaker and who was instrumental in the beginning of these early computing devices in World War II. Now, the Nazis were actually the first to develop the jet engines and rockets. That's why a lot of the Nazi scientists are taken and used by the Soviets and by the Americans, like Werner von Braun, later during the space race to develop our rockets, as we compete against the Soviet Union for dominance of the new frontier space. All right. Now, all of this is leading me to our last topic, and that's going to be the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan to end the war completely. So, nuclear technology in the 1930s, at the beginning of the war, is theoretical. And there is no better theoretical physicist than this man here, Mr. Albert Einstein. You might recognize him with the hair, right? Einstein was actually a German Jew who, in the 1920s, escaped Germany as the Nazi Party was rising up. Hitler had become the leader of the Nazi Party, and he was starting to inflame the racist, prejudice, anti-Semitism of the Nazi wing as he was taking over Germany. Einstein gets out of there, luckily, and he immigrates to the United States and becomes an American. And Einstein is the first to approach President Roosevelt with the theoretical possibility of a weapon such as the atomic bomb. And so FDR is going to take this knowledge from Einstein and he's going to commission a top secret government project to develop the weapon at the beginning of the war. And this was called the Manhattan Project. Now, they had some offices in Manhattan, which is, downtown New York City, but most of the actual facilities for research and developments, R&D, they were located throughout the country. So even the label Manhattan is kind of misleading. It wasn't just in New York City. Some of their biggest R&D laboratories were in, so do I have a map of this? There we go. Los Alamos right here. I want to definitely mention because my grandfather actually worked in the Los Alamos laboratory for a long time. My mother grew up in New Mexico there. And also my grandfather also later in life, he worked at the Berkeley laboratory. He was a nuclear physicist. He passed away in 2014. That was just 2 or 3 years after I started teaching here at University High School. But my grandfather was a brilliant mind, and he worked in nuclear physics for many, many decades. He died in his 70s, and you guys will probably never guess what he died from. He died from radiation poisoning. Working with all this radiation all that time. He had like 3 different sorts of cancer. He once said that he'd held like a nuclear core in his hands, and he said it felt kind of warm. I was like, okay, Grandpa, you're awesome. But yeah, so Los Alamos was one of the main research laboratories where a lot of the theoretics was worked out. My grandfather, he didn't work on the Manhattan Project itself. He wasn't that old, but he worked in these laboratories later on, like during the Cold War era. Alamogordo is where the first testing of the atomic bomb is going to take place. It's in the middle of the desert, and that was called Project Trinity. Oak Ridge was where a lot of the uranium and plutonium, the elements that we needed, are going to be procured. And I think those are the main ones that you should probably be aware of: Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, and Alamogordo. But you can see there's many other facilities for the Manhattan Project. And this was, again, the top secret project to develop an atomic weapon, a weapon of mass destruction, a weapon capable of not just destroying a building, but destroying an entire city, maybe even destroying an entire region. The theoretics behind it are basically for nuclear weapons, it's using the power of the sun. That's what that means. And you achieve this by creating the same reaction that the sun itself has, which is by splitting an atom or causing it to collide back together. It's fission versus fusion. And I'm not nearly smart enough to go into all the details, but that's basically what we're talking about. And the head research scientist that's going to help develop the atomic bomb. So Einstein was the theoretics, like saying, hey, this might be possible. Here you go. The guy who's actually going to make the bomb, the head scientist, is Robert Oppenheimer. Here he is pictured here. And like Einstein, Oppenheimer is also a Jew, an American Jewish person. And Oppenheimer, he watches the first testing at the Trinity site in Alamogordo, and he gives this quote from Hindu scripture where he says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It's kind of like the story of Frankenstein's monster, right? The Dr. Frankenstein, he made this terrible, terrible creation, and then he regretted it. It's the same thing with Oppenheimer. He made the atomic bomb, and he's going to spend a lot of the rest of his life saying that this is a weapon that should never have been put in man's hands. It's too powerful. It's too dangerous. It's too awful for something for humanity to control and use against one another. But America, We'll use it. And in fact, we will be the only nation ever to use the atomic bomb in warfare against another country. And that was done to end the war. What you need to understand is that our president, Franklin Roosevelt, who had initially, created the Manhattan Project, dies. He dies in April of 1945, just weeks before Hitler commits suicide. He gets us through most of the war, but can't quite see the end of it. And so when a president dies, of course, it is the vice president who is supposed to assume control. And our vice president, FDR's last vice president, was this man here, Harry Truman, Harry S. Truman. We had a president named Harry. Now, Harry Truman is a really interesting guy. I like to give you all a little bit of information about every president so that you can kind of help remember them. FDR had polio. He was doing all his stuff from a wheelchair. It was pretty incredible. FDR was elected 4 times. That's two more than any other president we've ever had before or since, because he did the New Deal programs, restored confidence and trust. He was like America's grandfather, talking us through everything and reassuring the public of his fireside chats. Everybody loved FDR. He would have been elected until, forever if he could have just lived longer, right? Truman was not very, highly educated. Truman had been a high school graduate. That was it. He never went to college. He had been a soldier, a common foot soldier in the First World War. He was exceptionally blind. He had glasses, that were about that thick, and his eyes looked kind of magnified because his glasses were so thick. And he's just a very honest, forthright individual. Harry Truman was the president that had a sign on his desk, the old Resolute in the Oval Office, that said, "The buck stops here." Basically, Truman truly believed that, as president, he was responsible for what happened and he would take responsibility, which I think is a very admirable trait to have in a leader, that they take responsibility for what happens, for everything that they're in charge of. So that's Harry Truman. And he is just a really, really honest guy. And he is now the president of the United States. And there's a great story about when he finds out. Basically, Truman was in the basement of the Capitol building playing poker with some of his old Senate buddies, because he'd been in the U.S. Senate. He was from Independence, Missouri. And they were playing a game of poker. And this was in April 1945, right after FDR had died in Warm Springs, Georgia. That was the retreat that many polio patients went to in Georgia. And the Secret Service is trying to find Truman, and they find him in the basement, in this poker game. And they say, "Sir, you're needed back at the White House. The president has died. You need to be sworn in." We're in the middle of World War II. Like, yeah, the Nazis are almost defeated, but we still have the Empire of Japan we're facing. Like, the war is definitely not over. And our president has just died. Like, holy bleep, right? And so Truman, he jumps up from the table, and the Secret Service, they're like, "Do you want to get in the car?" Truman doesn't even hear them. He just takes off running from the Capitol building. He runs the entire mile, all the way from the Capitol to the White House. He's out of breath. He's in pretty good shape for a dude in his 50s, but he's out of breath, huffing and puffing. When he gets in the White House and he gets like the green room or wherever it is that Eleanor Roosevelt often stayed in to find her, and he finally finds Eleanor Roosevelt, the first lady, the famous first lady, great American woman. He finds her, and he says, "Ma'am, he's out of breath. I'm so sorry. I just heard about your husband's death. Is there anything I can do? I'm so sorry for your loss." And Eleanor just, she goes up to Truman very calmly, and she clasps his hand and says, and looks into his eyes and says, "No, Harry, the real question is there anything we can do for you? Because now you're in charge." And he's like, "Oh, shika," right? Because now he's president and he's got to figure out how to end World War II. So, yeah, Harry Truman, ladies and gentlemen. I love me some Harry Truman. So now he's president. He's got to figure out what to do about the bomb. And he doesn't even know that the bomb exists, much less what it is. Like, he doesn't even know about the Manhattan Project. It was so top secret that the vice president of the United States was not even informed. Once he does learn about it, he will relay threats of it to Stalin at the last of the conventions that he's going to participate in. And Truman will decide to use it. This is after giving the Japanese plenty of forewarning. The Japanese were telling their citizenry to be prepared for an American invasion. They were having their citizens, men, women, and children, prepare with like sticks and stuff to fight off the Americans to the last. That they would die to the last citizen, just like as the soldiers had done on Okinawa and Iwo Jima. They would die to the last, defending their islands and their home. And so the American planes dropped a series of pamphlets on the Japanese cities in both English on one side and Japanese on the other, saying to the Japanese people, warning them, hey, your government is refusing to surrender. We don't want to hurt you guys, but like, y'all need to stop the fighting. We're trying to end the war. Tell your government to back off. Like, it's over. We don't want to, this is a warning. We dropped these over 20 intended targets, two of which we chose to actually drop the bombs on. When the Japanese refused to surrender, we dropped the first bomb on August 6, 1945, over Hiroshima. Hiroshima is a city that is kind of in the mountains, in the foothills, and so it lies in a low depression zone. And so when the atomic bomb, it was called Little Boy, when that atomic bomb was dropped, it detonates, the atomic chain reaction goes off, and the initial bomb site, everything is destroyed, everything is like instantly vaporized. The blast is so hot that the only thing that remained of citizens that were at the blast site itself was like the shadow of their molecules ingrained on the concrete that wasn't destroyed. And then from there, you had the explosion blast outward. And that's where you get the classic, nuclear mushroom cloud, it looks like, as the blast goes off. And then that's what they call the fallout. All of that blast sends out all this radiation that's going to poison every living thing that it comes into contact with. And depending on how much you get, that'll depend on your chances for survival. So if you're really close to the blast site and you get a lot of that radiation, you're going to be dead within hours, minutes to days. If you're further away from the blast site, you could survive if you get low enough doses of the radiation, and there will be effects from this for generations. There were Japanese that were had been affected by this, that are going to have children later on that have, multiple toes or fingers and stuff from the radiation poisoning. It was so bad. Now today, Hiroshima is totally rebuilt. There's a peace park there. It's very beautiful. But in the initial blast, 60,000 citizens and most of the entire city itself was destroyed by a single bomb. What had taken before hundreds of bombs, thousands of bombs to achieve, now was being done because of nuclear technology by one atomic bomb. And still, the Japanese refused to surrender. So 3 days later, on August 9th, 1945, the American bombers are going to drop a second atomic bomb on the coastal city of Nagasaki. Nagasaki, on the coast, the radiation is able to dissipate over the water, so it wasn't as deadly. But again, there will be many, many thousands of people in both sites, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that will be poisoned by the radiation, the fallout, and will be dying slow, agonizing deaths in the days, weeks, months, and years that follow these attacks. So it shows the world that we have a deadly, destructive new weapon. And Truman decides to use the bomb to finish the war as quickly as possible, to get the Japanese to surrender as quickly as possible, so that we would not have to send an American invasion force to do this instead. It was calculated by our generals that it could take upwards to 500,000 troops to try to do this, and we would probably lose over half of them. And this is after all of the island hopping campaign, after all the deaths on just those little islands like Okinawa and Iwo Jima. And Truman, being a soldier himself from World War I, he was not willing to do that. And so Truman, again, very forthright guy, he says, we need to end the war as quickly as possible. This is going to save American soldiers' lives. This is going to save, in the long run, Japanese civilian lives, because if we invaded, there would be just as many or more that would definitely die. And so to save lives, Truman decides to drop these atomic bombs. There could have also been other reasons at play as well. Truman definitely was very wary, very concerned about the threat that Stalin, the Soviet Union was presenting to us at the end of World War II, that Stalin was refusing to let go of Eastern Europe, where his Russian army was. They were just kind of holding on to it instead of freeing it from the Nazis. And so Truman may have also used the nuclear weapon, the atomic bombs, as a show of force to show Stalin, hey, don't mess with the United States. Look what we have. But it is by using these and showing the world what we have that it will bring on the nuclear age. This is huge, right? Because this is going to lead us into the Cold War, and why the Cold War is called that, right? When we're fighting the Soviet Union for the next 50 years after World War II, it's not a typical war. It's called the Cold War between us and the Soviet Union because it's a war of words, ideas, and the constant looming threat of a nuclear device, which is why neither side can really attack the other without risking total destruction. And it kind of kept both sides in check. There will be hotter points or actual fighting, actual warfare that will be conducted by proxy war, like in Korea, that's the Korean War, or in Vietnam, that's the Vietnam War, that will be about the Cold War struggle, our fight against communism and their fight against us and against democracy and things like that. But it always will have the threat of this nuclear weapon looming over it. And we still have that threat today. So was Truman justified in using the atomic bomb and putting the world in this new uncertain state of danger? It's for you to decide. But it did certainly end the fighting of World War II right after that, because the Japanese will surrender just a week later on August 15th, 1945. The Japanese surrender. The Japanese people hear on the radio for the first time the voice of their god, their emperor. Emperor Hirohito gives the address ordering the surrender. And this is VJ Day. This is Victory in Japan Day, just like we had May 8th, 1945, VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. And with the surrender of the Japanese, World War II is now officially, finally over. All right. Don't forget to, at the end of our lessons, do the summary in your notes. You should be answering the essential question right here. Okay. How did we win in the European theater and the Pacific theater? How did we beat the Nazis? We closed in, right? How did we beat the Japanese? Talk about island hopping. All right. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I will talk to you later. Goodbye.